Our next presenter is Tom Barton. Tom is a PhD student in politics at Royal Holloway in the University of London. Very jealous of the Royal Holloway campus. I guess you're probably not on it at the moment, but it's one of the most beautiful campuses, and I was trying to angle to get an invitation to attend. So maybe in a year or two, Tom, you can arrange this. So Tom's PhD focuses on voter ID laws, so very important topic, and more generally interested, of course, in elections and public opinion and quantitative research methods. Tom's going to be looking at a reproduction of a paper from 2016. So very much looking forward to it. Thanks very much, Tom.
Thanks. Let's get the slides up. So I'll start with a bit of a story whilst I'm just getting prepared. So this, how I came across this original 2016 paper from by Surridge was more by chance, and it was very humble beginnings. It came from a module I did in my master's, came from the reading list, and it was under the supplementary reading heading. So very much not at the forefront of what the module that week was about. But then from there, I started to think, does the theory really fit with this? How would I approach this differently? So firstly, just like to say thank you for coming along. I'm going to be talking about the link between social values and university attendance, specifically in the UK. As we know, education is becoming an increasingly important cleavage in Western politics, especially in the UK, if we're looking at things like class voting, which now is becoming driven by education. And this is also started to become an issue in the US and elsewhere. So in their 2016 article, Surridge looked at how values linked to education, particularly those who go on to get degrees, and conducted and concluded that individuals at universities undergo a socialisation. I'll talk a bit more about what I mean exactly by socialisation in a minute, to become more socially liberal. However, when I was reading this paper and thinking about it, I thought that there were a couple of issues around how the concepts were operationalised and a couple of the quantitative techniques. So for this analysis that I did, I re-specified the original analysis using a slightly different methodology, but trying to keep as much as the same as possible. And I conclude that whilst there might be some socialization, it's really self-selection that dominates this link. So the question is really around the direction of causality. And so the first lesson in reproducibility that I learned was that it can come from anywhere. So now when I look at papers, read any kind of papers for anything, I'm always thinking, how would I go about redoing this in a slightly different way to either try and prove the same outcome or a slightly different outcome. So it's well established that we know those who have gone to university and get a degree tend to be more socially liberal. Why this happens though, the direct mechanisms behind it are slightly less clear. As I said, Surridge concludes that it's the universities that impact the individual. However, I use a difference in difference approach. So I use age as my indicator, and I conclude that it's actually people are more liberal, they choose to go to university instead, even though there is probably still some socialization going on. So firstly, social liberalism in context I've defined it. So someone can be more socially liberal if they favour greater personal freedom, tolerate the freedom of others, and do not favour things like hierarchy or strict punishment for crimes. Socialisation is the idea that people adopt certain values when they're in a certain environment. So they go to university, they adopt the values of the peers around them and lecturers and other people that are present in the university environment. Whereas self-selection looks at values being formed earlier on in childhood, and there's research from Nundorf and Smets that consistently finds that we should be lowering our lower bound social values are formed in people. So they find evidence of it's from about the age of 10. Children can start to promote clear, defined social values. They might not be fully coherent, but they're there, and we can use them and track them through, and they have outcomes later on in life. So the socialization model relies on the ability of lecturers, peers, and anyone else to values. And the biggest problem I tended to find with this was typically in the UK, you only go to university for about 3 years if you only do an undergraduate degree. So that's a very short time in which your values could change significantly. So that's where my first question came: is this really a reproducible result? So there's uncertainty from a mechanism standpoint, basically, and that's what I try to unpick in my analysis. So self-selection does seem a more credible option because in your childhood you undergo a lot of change. You have parents, you have school teachers, you have peers, all to influence your views, attitudes, and values. And so I think it's often too easily dismissed when we should be taking it a lot more seriously. As I've said, we know those in their childhood and late teens have values and opinions. They may not be fully formed, but they're there. And so the tension within the literature was one of the motivating reasons for re-specifying Surridge's work. So from the literature, I don't aim to necessarily dismiss socialization. I think it's still there. So, and hypotheses reflect that. So H1 is is the idea that, of socialization. H2 is self-selection, and H3 kind of brings those together and looks and says that yes, university does have an effect. So in terms of the data, so it's the British Cohort Study 70. So it looks at individuals born in 1 week in 1970 in the UK, I think excluding Northern Ireland, and they're surveyed at multiple time points throughout their life, the latest, and they did a special COVID subsample for this, was last year at age 50. In their analysis, Surridge only used the ways when they were age 16 and 30, whereas I use 2 additional ways, one at 26 and then one at 42. The 42 one wasn't available at the time Surridge conducted their work, so that's why I've included it there, and I wanted a bit more of a long-term projection. One thing to say about this data source for those who's not particularly familiar with the UK data world, so there's the UK Data Service, which is open, fully public access, and the BCS 70 is on there, so it's all there to be seen, all waves, which is really useful for doing any kind of research. And they also contain some of the big longitudinal surveys that are used in the UK. So moving on to what I was looking at. So as with any longitudinal data set, there's going to be attrition, and I found this quite clearly, so I had to weight the data. I developed my own weights using the survey design package in R, which was really useful and really, so I'd recommend it. So acting as my independent was qualifications at age, I tested at age 20, 26 and age 30 just to compare. There wasn't much difference in the end, so I've tried to keep it the same as Surridge. So I've used education at age 30, and weighting data has shown in the way I have, it looks pretty representative of the original sample. That was found in the first wave, which again has its own validity to the population. So in terms of modeling it, so this first model is to test H1 and H2 and tries to directly replicate Surridge's work. So it simply looks at the relationship between values at age 16 and then the outcome being age 30. And this was a very simple model that just sought to test how good my data handling had been compared to Surridge's. And I'll show in a minute how well that came out. So the second equation is now the difference in difference, which is my D parameter, which I've specified there. So this interacted the wave with the education. So if there is a self-selection effect, we should expect to see when age is 16 and then they go on to get a degree in the future, there should be a significant difference. And I shall show that. Just a note on the value scales I use. So to try and keep it as close as possible, I copied the exact same value scales as Surridge did at age 1630, and then to include ways 42 and 26, I used a confirmatory factor analysis and checked they all were closely related to each other, measuring the same concept with liberalism, and then I recoded this into a 0 to 10 scale just to aid interpretation. So the replicating Surridge model looks very similar, which I was very happy about to see, which shows that those who had more liberal values at age 16 have more liberal values at age 30. So nothing unexpected there, and there is an effect for degree. So I'm finding the same things as Surridge, but again, as I said, for me, this was about operationalization more than anything. So for me, this model only shows value consistency and not a direct socialization effect. Moving on to my then re-specification in terms of descriptives, see that as people get older, their values become more authoritarian, less liberal, and then there's an initial gap for those who went on to get a degree and those who didn't. This is at age 16 before they would have even maybe thought about going to university. So there is something different about those who choose to go to university, I find. And then there is an increase in the gap, but I don't particularly see this as outweighing the initial effect. So in model form, it looks a bit like this. So overall, we see that liberalism declines is lower at each time point than it was at age 16. Then, so this is my self-selection effect, which is quite significant, both statistically and substantively, that those who went on to get a degree were more liberal even when they were only 16, so before attending university. This holds when we include our socialization estimates, which is then not significant at age 26 when most people would have got a degree if they went on to get one. I checked with, so there's a lot of open data on percentage of demographics of university students in the UK, and there were very few people who, at the time when this data would have been collected, who were older than 26 while still studying. So I think this still holds. We see one difference to point out is for those who do postgraduates, and the reasoning for this is postgraduates take you longer, so you're in the university environment for a few more years, and this may tip over into a significant effect, which I find there. Just a note on the age 42, it's not quite as drastic as the age 26 and 30, and this could be because of just cohort effects that have been noted by the likes of Tilly in their paper, who found that in the UK, that party leaders and prime ministers of the day could have an effect on values for certain people. So it might just be an effect of that. And you could think about when people go out and get a job, they interact with a wider group of people, therefore the effect might be decreased. They become slightly more liberal as their horizons are expanding in terms of who and the type of people they interact with. So I'm not overly concerned by this. even though it's slightly counter to what we might theorize if we're expecting purely linear effects. And then in terms of robustness, just to check, there were, in the value scales, there were items that were alike, but there were only 3 of them, and I didn't think they fully captured liberalism as a whole. But I tested it anyway just to see if it holds, and for the most part, everything seems to. So I'm relatively confident in my findings. Also, I haven't implemented it fully yet, but I've done, to account for multiple observations of the same respondent, I've done a random intercepts model, which again shows the effects holding. So I can be relatively confident in this. And also in robustness, we do see some socialization effects becoming significant. So this is why I'm not fully dismissing it at this point. I'm just re-emphasizing that self-selection may actually be dominating this more than was originally thought. So in conclusion, and just notes on reproducibility, I sought to re-examine the findings for potential drawbacks. I found something slightly contrasting, but not completely different. I found, to strengthen my process, that contacting the author was a good move. So I have to thank Dr. Surridge. She was very helpful, and she tried to provide as much help she could, but a lot of the her data files were in her office, and this was May of last year, so she can access it, but she's very helpful nonetheless. And I also tried a lot of different methods along my way. I tried a lot of different things, thinking, okay, is this good? Is this bad? Why am I using this over this? And finally settling on this method. So what you see here in this very short presentation, there was obviously a lot of background work that went into it to try and make everything as rigorous as possible and flowing. So I also found it beneficial to ask myself, why did the original author do this? Why did they choose this method? Why didn't they do this? So it's really engaging as critically as possible with every step of the way. So in going forward, I aim to look at this in terms of subject study. Within the data set, I found a problem that the subject studied variable was an open text variable. So coding that is a big task. I'm still slowly working through. And I only actively diverged for methodological reasons, and I tried to follow the original work as closely as possible, just to really tighten up any comparisons. And for me, going forward, I think doing work like this has helped me, and it makes my academic journey more of a conversation rather than having papers that many people download, read a couple of times, maybe cite once or twice in their articles. So it really brings it all together for me, and for someone who's very much at the early stages of their academic career, hopefully I can take this forward and make it a part of my future work as I go forward, especially as I'm looking to get into more data set building, especially with my PhD. I'm currently working on a data set that looks at voter-ID laws, and I obviously want that to be as up to date and as reproducible as possible, because it's my own work and I want it to have a valuable impact in the field. So thank you, and I look forward to any questions.
Thanks very much, Tom. That was very interesting. Sure, I might bring you in at some point if you can think, just given your political science background, but I'll just deal with a few of the earlier questions, maybe while, Shura, you're thinking about some. From YouTube, this question, is it possible to get your slides? Is there a link for them?
Yeah, I'm going to upload them on my website, and I'll tweet them out later in the week. I can pop them in the Slack as soon as I finish here, though, as well, if that's helpful.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you very much. There's also a question on the Slack, just wanting to follow up a little bit more to understand a little bit more about what liberal means. Do you know what goes into that question in the British election studies?
Yeah, so one of the problems I had actually was that they wouldn't use the exact same questions
Mm.
for each wave. So when the age 16 wave, so this would have been done in 1986. And a lot of the questions were on things at the time, such as homosexuality, things like that, and more death penalty type questions. And they were questions very much of their time. But luckily that wave was already kind of coded by Surridge, and when they did it, they referenced, okay, we're using this understanding. And then age 30, it was more of your standard value questions you get in most modern surveys. So things, again, like death penalty, but they were a lot more standardized and a lot easier. So that, as I said, the 26 and 42 waves, again, the 42 wave was kind of standardized, 26 was getting there. So that's where I brought in the confirmatory factor analysis, and that's where I got in contact with Surridge, just to get some thoughts from her. And as I said, she was very helpful on that. But a lot of them are to do with attitudes towards homosexuality, same-sex marriage, death penalty. Trying to think what else now. It's been a while. Things to do with like are criminal sentences too harsh or not harsh enough? Things like that. That's what they tended to focus on, the questions.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Shira, did you want to ask any questions from a poli-sci background?
Not so much questions for poli-sci. I haven't seen, I know it's kind of selection is an issue, but I haven't seen kind of like people targeting that self-selection idea. So it was really useful talk. Yeah, in terms of diff and diff, I agree it's a better causal strategy. And maybe you showed this, but it's one, I mean, diff and diff is also not immune, and if there's pre-trends of people who are, people are already trending in a certain way before they enter into college. So yeah, if you have multiple pre-college time periods, that might be really interesting. That might be kind of good to show visually those trends. But yeah, look forward to reading the paper.
Thanks. Yeah, the previous wave to the 16 was at age 10, I think it was taken. And I'm not entirely sure if they asked any value type questions, but I can definitely go back and have a look. Yeah, so in terms of the actual data source, it's not the best, but I was really just looking to re-specify Surridge's earlier work. So maybe another paper could be looking at a more robust data source that measures values a bit more consistently.
If anyone has any other questions, feel free to put them into the chat or the Slack. It was interesting to me. So, I mean, when I do these types of exercises as well, I find that often the authors are incredibly helpful and polite, but it's sort of interesting that we're so dependent on that in order to do this work. I don't know if maybe you wouldn't have been able to do this work if they weren't polite and helpful. I know in my case, that's certainly the case. Did you have any thoughts around like how we could not be so reliant on that as you were going through?
It's a difficult one. I think a lot could be done around what we include in like the supplementary material for papers, things like that. But part of why I got in contact with the author was to almost check what I was doing. I had a good idea of what I wanted to do and thought I was doing it right. It was more, so a bit of it was a checking process. But yeah, I'd say just maybe a bit more guidance in the supplementary material, which I think has come out of a lot of talks today. So
yeah, I'm really keen to try and normalize this idea of data cards and trying to document our data a little bit better than we perhaps do. Shira is pointing out that there's a nice diff and diff R package and associated paper in terms of these pre-treatment periods.
Yeah, I'm just gonna so I didn't say it in the presentation, but I noticed so when I first started doing this work, I only just gained my undergrad degree, less than a year. So contacting someone who was a senior lecturer at a top university was a bit daunting. But once it was done, it was a massive relief and everything. So I'd say to anyone who's at the very early stage of their career, just jump in and do it. You normally get a good response.
Yeah, absolutely. In almost all the cases, I've found fairly positive results, even when I've had some issues with their work. Even people have been fairly okay. We might leave it there unless anyone wants to follow up with anything, and just say thank you once again to Tom. A very interesting presentation, and hopefully you get a publication out of it. It'd be nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy for people to contact me via email, Twitter if they have any follow-up questions. Happy to chat some more about it. Thanks.